My boy best friend was abandoned by his parents who fled to China while they were gone. He ended up in hospital after drinking hand sanitizer to impress a girl, so I called social services, and he was not happy. My friendship with Owen was evidence that boy-girl friendships don't work, but not for the reason you're thinking. Our friendship started when we were 14. He was the wild card, the type to validate any bad decision you made. And since we lived in Ireland where the socially acceptable drinking age is 12, he was dangerous. Except I didn't see it that way back then. All I knew was that he was fun to be around and he just got me. Plus, we had practically built an empire together because he had like 15 male friends and I had almost 25 female friends. So we'd both be invited to literally everything. So, in the summer before senior year, we were practically the king and queen of people our age in Dublin, until Owen took it too far. You see, he had a crush on this girl called Zoe, and I could see why. She was Eastern European and was practically the beauty standard. So, like any good friend, I tried many times to set them up together. But, well, let's just say she was not picking up what Owen was putting down. But Owen kept trying, except not in a creepy way, more like in a puppy chasing its own tail kind of way. So one day in July, me, Owen, and our empire were hanging out around Stephen's Green, one of the biggest shopping centers in Dublin. We were around 17 and it was 77 degrees Fahrenheit, super hot for Ireland. And just like the stereotype, we were all drunk as heck. And that's when I learned just how R-worded Owen really is. Let me paint the picture. It was right after the pandemic. None of us were 18 and we had run out of alcohol. So Owen did what any respectable 17-year-old would do in that situation. He grabbed Zoe's hand sanitizer and started pouring it into his mouth. I tried to grab it from him. He won that battle. Our entire empire was laughing and cheering him on like it was the funniest thing in the world. In that moment, I realized that to them, we were nothing more than the party holders. Within minutes, his eyes were rolling to the back of his head. He was staggering around and falling into the outside seating area of the nearby restaurants. I tried to pull him to the side and get him to the recovery position, but I wasn't strong enough to do it alone, and no one wanted to help until I started shouting at the 6-foot boys with their hands in their pockets. Luckily, we managed to get him to vomit in an alley. My heart was racing while I called the ambulance. But while we waited, he began to regain consciousness. Before I continue, you have to know Owen hates physical contact. Even when our hands accidentally brush against each other, he does a dramatic full-body shiver and his face contorts into disgust. So when his first words after regaining consciousness were him asking me to spoon him, I almost threw up in my mouth a little. But then I thought about his family that, aside from monthly cash payments, abandoned him in Ireland to start a new life in China when he was just 13. So mostly out of worry and pity, I did it, especially since his skin was getting significantly colder, and I wanted to make sure he survived after an hour had passed me. And Owen found ourselves still waiting for the paramedics. And by this point, he was using what little energy he had left to push me off him and beg me for a cigarette. I still remember the 17-year-old look of desperation in his eyes. And if I'm being honest, how annoying he was being is what made me finally give in. When he took the first puff, a smile plastered on his face. He looked like a terminal cancer patient being told they're in remission. But halfway in, he was staggering again. I rubbed my temples together and tried to remind myself that his home life was even worse than mine, that he was just trying to cope, until he threw up again because mixed in with the bile was red, like a lot of red. And the paramedics made it even worse, because when they arrived, they refused to treat him. "I'm not treating another substance addict," one of the ladies said, laughing. Another one just stood there waving at him. "Sayonara, Asian boy," before driving away. Owen started shivering and tears were streaming down my face. I couldn't call my parents, because I knew they would injure me and kick me out of my house. I started screaming at them that he wasn't an addict. It was just a stupid dare, but they were already walking back to their ambulance. "He needs to sleep it off. Call his parents to pick him up." The older one called over his shoulder. They drove away, leaving me sitting there in shock. Owen had started vomiting again. But this time, I noticed something terrifying. There was blood mixed in, actual blood. I was completely panicking now. I couldn't call my parents. They would absolutely kill me for drinking and probably kick me out. Owen's parents were literally on another continent. Most of our friends had abandoned us. In desperation, I called the one person I'd promised never to involve in my messes, my cousin Morgan. Morgan was 24 and worked as an EMT in a neighboring district. She'd always been the responsible one in the family and had lectured me countless times about my partying habits. She was also the only person in my family who knew the full extent of my double life and had kept my secrets, even while disapproving of my choices. The last time I'd seen her was at a family dinner where she pulled me aside and warned me that I was heading down a dangerous path. I'd rolled my eyes and told her to mind her own business. Now here I was begging for her help from a dirty alley while my best friend vomited blood. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment of panic. But Morgan was also the only medical professional I knew who might actually help without calling my parents. She answered on the third ring, and I immediately burst into tears, explaining everything in a rush. To her eternal credit, Morgan didn't waste time lecturing me. She just asked for our location and said she'd be there in 15 minutes. True to her word, Morgan's car screeched into the alley exactly 14 minutes later. She jumped out with a medical bag and immediately knelt beside Owen. After checking his vitals and examining the hand sanitizer bottle, her face got really serious. This contains methanol, not ethanol. He needs a hospital right now or he could go blind or worse. I started crying harder at that, and Morgan made a quick decision that could have cost her her job. She was off duty but had access to her ambulance. She ran back to her car, drove it away, and returned 5 minutes later in an official ambulance. She loaded Owen in, hooked him up to some monitors, and told me to get in. If anyone asks, I was driving by and saw you. Understood. I nodded gratefully, holding Owen's cold hand as Morgan drove with the sirens blaring. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and Morgan barking medical terms into her radio. Owen drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally squeezing my hand so weakly it was barely perceptible. I kept replaying the moment he grabbed the sanitizer, wishing I'd been faster, wishing I'd stopped him, wishing I'd never introduced him to Zoe in the first place. The guilt was overwhelming, even though logically I knew this was his decision. Morgan kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror with a mixture of concern and disappointment that made me feel about 2 inches tall. At the hospital, things didn't get much better. The intake nurse recognized Owen immediately, which was another bad sign. Kim again? She said with a sigh, looking at his chart. Third alcohol poisoning this year. He's taking up a bed someone else needs. Morgan stepped in professionally. This isn't standard alcohol poisoning. He ingested methanol from hand sanitizer. He needs methanol antidote protocol immediately. The nurse still seemed reluctant, so Morgan pulled her aside and had a whispered conversation. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught phrases like parents in China, effectively abandoned, and potential organ damage. Whatever she said worked because they whisked Owen away on a gurney. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork and questions. A doctor told me Owen had severe methanol poisoning, which could have been fatal if we'd waited much longer. They pumped his stomach and started some treatment with ethanol, actual drinking alcohol, which apparently counteracts methanol poisoning somehow. The doctor explained that methanol breaks down into formaldehyde and formic acid in the body, which are incredibly toxic. But ethanol prevents this conversion by keeping the liver busy. It was weirdly ironic that they were actually giving him medical-grade vodka through an IV to save his life. They needed parental consent for the full treatment protocol, though, which meant I had to admit that Owen basically lived alone. His parents paid for everything remotely but weren't physically present in his life. This triggered a whole other set of problems as the hospital was required to contact social services. I waited in the hallway while a series of hospital staff and administrators discussed Owen's situation in hushed tones. Occasionally, one of them would emerge to ask me another question about his living situation, each time looking more concerned than the last. I felt like I was betraying him by revealing his secrets, but also knew that continuing to hide the truth could literally kill him. A social worker named DT arrived within an hour and started asking me tons of questions about Owen's living situation. While all this was happening, my phone was blowing up with notifications. Word had spread throughout the empire about what happened, but not in a supportive way. Someone had forwarded me screenshots of a group chat where people were making jokes about Owen drinking hand sanitizer. Zoe was apparently telling everyone he did it to impress her, which made the whole thing seem even more pathetic. JP, who had been Owen's friend since primary school, had started a poll asking whether drinking hand sanitizer or eating Tide Pods was more stupid. These were people who had been at Owen's home less than 48 hours ago, drinking his parents' expensive liquor and using his PlayStation. Now they were treating his medical emergency like the latest meme. Some of them were even using the hashtag #SanitizeSurvivor mockingly in their stories, which made me physically ill. The rage I felt seeing those messages was unlike anything I'd experienced before. When Stacy, the biggest gossip in our group, had the audacity to show up at the hospital to see how he was doing, but really to get more gossip, I completely lost it. I confronted her in the waiting room, screaming about loyalty and friendship until security had to intervene. They almost kicked me out, but Morgan vouched for me, explaining I was just stressed about my friend. Stacy left in tears, but not before telling me that everyone thought I was overreacting and that Owen would be fine. He always is. Her dismissive attitude made me realize how normalized Owen's self-destructive behavior had become in our social circle. It wasn't just that they abandoned him in a crisis. They genuinely didn't understand that this time was different, that he could have died. The worst part was realizing that I had been part of creating this culture, laughing along at his previous stunts, filming his dangerous behaviors for our entertainment. The line between harmless fun and potentially fatal recklessness had been blurred for so long that no one, including me, recognized when it was finally crossed. 2 days later, Owen was still in the hospital. The social worker, DT, had investigated his living situation and confirmed what I'd said. His parents paid for an apartment and sent money for food and expenses, but they hadn't physically been in Dublin for over 6 months. They communicated with him mainly through brief WeChat messages. DT explained she was building a case for emergency emancipation, which would legally recognize Owen as independent. In the meantime, the hospital had to keep him under observation. When Owen finally regained full consciousness, his first reaction was to try to minimize everything. It wasn't that serious, he insisted, despite the IVs still attached to his arms. Can you help me get out of here? My parents will freak if they get the hospital bill. That's when I finally lost my patience with him. Are you kidding me right now? I exploded. You nearly died from drinking hand sanitizer. The doctor said you could have gone blind or had brain damage. Your friends all abandoned you and are now making fun of you online. And you're worried about a bill your rich parents will barely notice? He went cold at that, shutting down emotionally like he always did when confronted. You didn't need to involve Morgan or tell them about my parents, he said quietly. Now I've got social services on my back. Thanks a lot. We argued for nearly an hour with me calling him self-destructive and ungrateful while he accused me of overreacting and ruining his life. It was our first real fight after 4 years of friendship. I left that night feeling like maybe our whole relationship had been built on partying and mutual enabling rather than actual friendship. That feeling only intensified when we discovered the Empire had planned a massive party that weekend and had explicitly uninvited both of us. One of Owen's former best friends, JP, posted in the group chat, "No hand sanitizer drinkers or their babysitters allowed. We want to actually have fun." From Owen's hospital window, we could see the Instagram stories posting in real time from the party, which was happening at JP's house where we'd all hung out countless times. People were posting selfies in the exact spots where Owen and I had taken our own photos just weeks earlier. Someone was wearing Owen's vintage Bulls cap that he'd left there after the last party. It was like we'd been completely erased and replaced, as though our 4 years as the center of this social group had never happened. The complete social exile hit Owen harder than me. I was angry, but he seemed genuinely bewildered that people he'd considered close friends would turn on him so quickly. I would have done anything for those guys, he said quietly, watching the stories update. I let them drink my parents' expensive liquor, crash at my place whenever they needed to. I thought we were brothers. I tried to comfort him, telling him they weren't worth it anyway. But he suddenly lashed out. This is all your fault. If you hadn't made such a huge deal about everything and called social services, we'd still be at that party right now. I left the hospital that night wondering if our friendship was even worth saving. For 3 days after Owen was released, he completely ghosted me. Wouldn't answer calls or texts. I knew he was back in his apartment because the social worker had updated me, but he was clearly avoiding any contact. I tried everything. Leaving voicemails, sending memes that usually made him laugh, even standing outside his building once like a complete stalker before losing my nerve and leaving. The silence from him hurt more than I expected, especially after everything we'd been through. I found myself compulsively checking the Empire's social media, watching as they continued their parties and hangouts without us. It felt like watching my former life from behind glass, simultaneously missing it and seeing how toxic it had been. On the 4th day, I finally got a text. Can we talk? We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the opposite side of Dublin from our usual hangouts. The awkwardness between us was painful. We'd spent nearly every day together for 4 years, and suddenly we were like strangers, carefully selecting neutral topics. He looked different somehow, maybe thinner, definitely more subdued. The manic energy that usually surrounded him was gone, replaced by something quieter and more uncertain. We made small talk about the weather and the cafe's mediocre coffee for nearly 20 minutes before either of us broached the real issues. Finally, I brought up the elephant in the room. I think we should just start over, I suggested. Forget the Empire and all those fake friends. We can build something better, something real. Owen looked down at his untouched coffee. I don't know how to exist without them, he admitted. My whole identity is being the crazy guy everyone wants to party with. Without that, who am I? Then he suggested throwing an even bigger party to win everyone back, proving he'd learned absolutely nothing from nearly dying. I just stared at him, unable to believe that after everything, the hospital, the blood tests, the stomach pumping, his solution was to double down on the very behavior that had landed him there. It was like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove and then be surprised when they get burned. He outlined his plan with increasing enthusiasm, describing how we could get better alcohol, maybe even score some weed and throw the party of the century. As he spoke, his eyes regained some of their old spark. But it wasn't the healthy kind of excitement. It was desperate, almost manic. Our conversation was interrupted by a call from DT, the social worker. She'd arranged for Owen to meet with a counselor named Storm, who specialized in teen substance issues. Owen immediately refused, but DT made it clear it wasn't optional if he wanted to pursue emancipation. When he hung up, he looked at me miserably. Will you come with me to the counselor thing? It was the first genuine vulnerable request he'd made, so I agreed. Storm's office was nothing like I expected. Instead of a sterile clinical environment, it was a converted warehouse space with comfortable chairs and art everywhere. Storm herself was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and tattoos covering both arms. Her first question threw us both. How would you define your friendship? Owen and I looked at each other blankly. We'd never actually thought about it. We party together, Owen finally said. We have the same friends. We look out for each other, I added, though recent events had called that into question. Storm nodded thoughtfully. So your connection is primarily built around social activities and mutual acquaintances. What do you do together when you're not partying or with other people? Again, silence. We genuinely couldn't think of anything. Our entire relationship had been built around the empire and drinking. Storm didn't judge us, just assigned homework. We had to spend time together doing something completely new that didn't involve alcohol or our usual social circle. After some debate, we decided to volunteer at a community garden near Owen's apartment. Neither of us knew the first thing about plants, but it met Storm's criteria of something new. On our first day, we met Peter, the elderly man who ran the garden. He was in his 82nd but moved with the energy of someone decades younger. He showed us how to weed vegetable beds and prune tomato plants. Owen complained constantly about the dirt and the heat, and I nearly gave up on the whole exercise. But then, Peter sat us down during a water break and shared his own story. He'd been an alcoholic in the 1970s in Dublin, drinking away his youth until a near-death experience similar to Owen's. I chose plants because they demand patience, he told us. You can't rush a tomato to ripen. You can't force a seed to grow faster by yelling at it. Nature taught me the patience I needed for recovery. Something about Peter's quiet dignity resonated with Owen in a way my lectures never had. We were just getting ready to leave when two familiar faces appeared at the garden gate. Zoe and JP, the very people whose attention Owen had been desperate to recapture. They sauntered in with smirks, JP filming on his phone. Wow, community service already? Zoe called out laughing. Didn't realize hand sanitizer was that illegal? I tensed, expecting Owen to either try to impress them or retreat in shame. Instead, Peter stepped forward. These young people are volunteers, not serving any sentence except perhaps the one life gives us all. The mandate to grow and improve. They're welcome here. Are you interested in joining them? His simple dignity left them momentarily speechless. JP lowered his phone, suddenly looking uncertain. Nah, we were just passing by, he mumbled. When they left, Owen was quiet for a long time. That was the first time I've ever seen JP back down from anything, he finally said. Peter didn't even raise his voice. Just as we were starting to make progress, Owen got devastating news. His parents were returning to Dublin, but not for the reason he'd hoped. They were coming to sell their property and finalize arrangements to send Owen to a boarding school in China. They'd be in town for exactly 1 week, which gave us precious little time to convince the courts to approve his emancipation petition. We worked frantically with Morgan and DT to gather evidence of his parents' neglect, bank statements showing their minimal contact, school records of missed parent-teacher conferences, and testimonials from neighbors who rarely saw them. But we needed character witnesses beyond just me, someone who could testify that Owen was capable of living independently. Owen had to humble himself to ask Peter and Storm to speak on his behalf, admitting to them the full extent of his parents' absence from his life. The day before the hearing, we got an unexpected text from Zoe asking to meet. Hope flared briefly in Owen's eyes. Maybe she finally saw him differently. We met her at a cafe where she got straight to the point. I heard about your court thing tomorrow, she said. I could testify that you've been living alone all this time. Everyone knows it. For a moment I thought she was genuinely offering help, until she continued. But I need something in return. Help me get back in touch with Morgan's crowd. They're having these exclusive parties now, and I heard you've been hanging out with her. I watched Owen's face as he processed this. The old Owen would have jumped at any chance to please Zoe. Instead, he slowly shook his head. I can't do that. Morgan's helping me because she cares, not because she wants something. Thanks for the offer, but no. Zoe's face hardened. Wow, hand sanitizer really did fry your brain. Good luck tomorrow, loser. As she flounced out, Owen looked at me with a mixture of sadness and pride. That's the first time I've ever said no to her. It felt weird, but good. The hearing itself was intense. Owen's parents showed up with an expensive lawyer who portrayed them as concerned, loving parents simply wanting the best education for their son. They spoke about cultural differences in parenting and their desire to give Owen independence while supporting him financially. It was a convincing performance, until Owen's barrister cross-examined them. When was the last time you attended a parent-teacher conference at Owen's school? Blank stares. Do you know who his best friend is? They pointed at me but couldn't remember my name. The real breakthrough came when their lawyer accidentally referred to Owen as their obligation rather than their son. During closing arguments, the judge noticed, raising her eyebrows slightly before granting temporary emancipation, pending a 6-month review of Owen's progress. Outside the courthouse, Owen was ecstatic. We should celebrate. Let's throw a party at my place. Just us and some actual friends this time. When I hesitated, his face fell. What's wrong? I thought you'd be happy. I am happy for you, I said carefully. But celebrating with alcohol after everything that's happened, it feels like going backward. You sound like Storm, he complained. 1 drink isn't going to kill me. It's not about one drink, I said. It's about patterns. We fall back into the same habits and you've changed, he interrupted, anger flashing in his eyes. You used to be fun. Now you're just boring. He stormed off, leaving me standing alone outside the courthouse. For the next week, I threw myself into gardening with Peter, ignoring Owen's increasingly frequent texts asking if I wanted to hang out. Peter noticed my distraction and finally asked what was troubling me. I explained the whole situation, our toxic friendship, the Empire's collapse, and my fear that Owen was slipping back into old patterns despite everything. Peter listened without interrupting, then said something I'll never forget. True friendship isn't about making each other comfortable in destructive habits. It's about being honest even when it hurts. That night, I wrote Owen the longest message I'd ever sent him, explaining why our friendship, as it existed before, couldn't continue. I told him I cared about him too much to watch him self-destruct again. I said I didn't want to be his enabler or his babysitter, but I also didn't want to lose him entirely. I explained that real friendship meant wanting the best for each other even when it was difficult. After I sent it, I was sure he'd hate me forever. 3 days later, he showed up at the community garden. He was sober, his eyes clear as he asked if he could talk to me privately. I read your message like 50 times, he said when we sat down on a bench away from the others. At first, I was pissed. Then I was hurt. Then I realized you were right. He explained that he'd gone to an extra session with Storm, showing her my message. She said it was the most mature thing she'd seen from either of us. She also explained something I never understood before, why boy-girl friendships like ours don't work. I raised an eyebrow, assuming he meant the usual cliché about romance inevitably developing. Not what you're thinking, he clarified. She said friendships don't work when they're built on enabling and codependency rather than genuine care. That's what we were doing. I validated your need to rebel. You validated my recklessness, and we called it friendship. Over the following months, we actually rebuilt our relationship from scratch. I helped Owen navigate living independently while he started taking classes at a community college. We still hung out, but instead of wild parties, we had movie nights and study sessions with Morgan and a few new friends we'd made through Peter's community center. Sometimes we'd spot members of our old empire around Dublin, but they felt like strangers from another lifetime. By Christmas, exactly 5 months after the hand sanitizer incident, Owen received formal emancipation. We celebrated with sparkling cider in the community garden greenhouse that Peter had let us renovate as our project. That night, Owen told me something he'd never admitted before. I kept you at arm's length all these years because I was terrified of genuine connection. After my parents basically abandoned me, I figured everyone would eventually leave, so I never let anyone get too close. I confessed my own truth. I enabled your behavior because having an empire made me feel less invisible in my own dysfunctional home. My parents barely noticed me unless I was causing problems. We're not perfect now. He still sometimes yearns for his wild days, and I still occasionally enable his bad ideas. But we're learning. Our friendship works now because we've stopped trying to escape our problems through each other and instead face them together, side by side, rather than falling into each other. And that's the real reason why boy-girl friendships like ours don't work without effort. Not because they inevitably turn romantic, but because without honesty, boundaries, and genuine care, they become just another way to hide from ourselves. So yeah, that's the story of how I watched my best friend drink hand sanitizer and accidentally destroyed our teenage empire. Not my proudest moment, but maybe sharing it here will help someone else recognize toxic patterns in their own friendships before they end up in an alley holding their half-dead friend while waiting for an ambulance. Dublin teenage social scene, man. It's no joke.